When James Michael Curley was elected for a fourth term as mayor in 1945, he actually was under indictment in Washington, D.C. for mail fraud. A rather complicated story involving an unscrupulous wartime profiteer who had gotten Curley to invest in his scheme, put Curley's name on his letterhead. The check he gave to Curley wound up bouncing. Curley had nothing more to do with this gentleman, but then in 1943-44, when the federal government was investigating this profiteer, they found his old letterhead with James Michael Curley's name on it, and so charged Curley with being an accomplice in this gentleman's scheme to defraud the federal government and profiteer off of the manufacture of the machinery of war. No one in Boston took Curley's indictment very seriously, but then in January of 1946, he went on trial in Washington, D.C., and wound up being convicted. And in the fall of 1947, having exhausted various appeals, Curley was sent to jail in Danbury, Connecticut. And he was in jail for a couple of months. As he put it, he was a guest of the state of Connecticut. And then, while he was gone, the city clerk, John Hynes, administered the city. And Hynes was a very able administrator and also loyal to Curley, as loyal as anyone could be. And Hynes had accepted the position as city clerk, and the legislature had seen an opportunity here to prevent the city clerk from having political ambitions, that if Hynes vowed never to run for mayor of Boston, he could hold the position of city clerk for as long as he wanted. And Hynes thought that was acceptable, rather than striving for elective office just to have a lifetime employment in a very good job, at which Hynes was very capable. So while Curley was away, as he said, as a guest of the state of Connecticut, Hynes ran the city, and then Curley came back. President Truman pardoned Curley on the day before Thanksgiving. Every member of the Massachusetts delegation signed a letter to President Truman urging him to pardon Curley because Curley was elderly, Curley was in bad health, and they thought it would be a humane thing to let him out of prison. So Truman did. Well, every member of the Massachusetts delegation but one. That was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the newly elected congressman from Boston. And you may recall that Kennedy's grandfather had been driven out of the mayor's race in 1914 by James Michael Curley, and the Kennedys have long memories. Curley, though, gets out of prison, comes home on Thanksgiving, has Thanksgiving dinner at his home in Jamaica Plain, then the next morning goes to City Hall and comes out for his lunch break at City Hall, and Curley could never resist saying something clever. So he said to the assembled reporters, "More has been done in the 3 hours I have been here this morning than was done in the 3 hours I was away." John Hynes thought this was a personal slap at him. I've heard from Hynes's sons that they never saw their father angry except for that night when he was furious that Curley had taken the opportunity of making a snide remark about Hynes, who is a very able administrator and had, in fact, very ably run the city. And Hynes decided that he would run against James Michael Curley in 1949. Curley thought it was ridiculous that that little clerk, as he called Hynes, would challenge him for the mayoralty, but Hynes did. And by this time, enough other people had been annoyed or infuriated by Curley that they were prepared to vote for an alternative. Of course, the business community also was behind Hynes, and Hynes, like Curley, was an Irish Catholic. He was from the city, and he had been part of Boston politics for many years. And Hynes was elected. And Hynes's idea was to create a new Boston that would put behind it the Boston of James Michael Curley. And Hynes also recognized the failings in Boston, the declining tax base, the eroded industrial base, and saw it necessary to create a new Boston to move beyond what Boston had been. Now, Hynes has a couple of important components to the creation of a new Boston. One is partners in Boston's academic and business communities. The president of Boston College, the Reverend J.C.V. Joyce, convened what are called citizens' seminars at Boston College, bringing together academics, business leaders, and others to discuss how to transform Boston into a new kind of city. And these citizen seminars do generate many ideas for the revitalization of Boston, some of them salutary, some of them more questionable. Another thing identified here as a way to improve Boston was what then was called urban renewal. After the Second World War, the federal government set out to help remake cities. The federal government, as a way of improving the housing in cities, promised to give cities money for slum clearance. That is, if a city wanted to remove slums, the federal government would support this effort because they didn't want people living in slums. Cities saw this as an opportunity to get a whole lot of federal cash to demolish neighborhoods and replace down on their heels neighborhoods with more upscale places. So one of the first urban renewal projects here in Boston was in the South End, an area called the New York Streets, Albany Street, Oneida Street, named New York Streets because the names of the streets echoed the names of cities in the state of New York. So the New York streets of the South End were first targeted, and one of the big targeters of this area as a blighted area in need of renewal was the Boston Herald, a newspaper. The newspapers in Boston at this time were all headquartered along Washington Street, the crowded inner city. They wanted to build more spacious headquarters somewhere else, and the Boston Herald had its eyes on the New York streets, and so trumpeted in their pages the desirability of removing this blighted neighborhood, which was home to dozens of 27 different ethnicities: African Americans, Armenians, Albanians, Italians, Jews living in the New York streets, not aware that where they were living had been declared a slum by those who knew better. So the Boston Herald champions the demolition of the New York streets and the transformation of this area into a light industrial area with the most important of the industrial edifices in it, the headquarters of the Boston Herald on what becomes Herald Street, and then other ideas follow. The demolition of the West End in the late 1950s, the demolition of Scully Square. And there's also an emphasis in this period on separating residential areas from commercial areas from government areas. It's a French idea about the best organization of cities. Probably not a wise idea to borrow your ideas from France, but that's a story for another day. This was the leading thought among city planners of the era. In 1957, Boston creates the Boston Redevelopment Authority, an agency appointed by the mayor which will help redevelop the city. The idea is to remake the city. Mel King, who lived in the New York streets, and when he was away at college in the 1950s, learned that this area had been deemed a slum and was actually demolished, referred to the BRA as Blacks Running Again. But the BRA wasn't simply targeting African American neighborhoods. It was targeting any neighborhood that it thought could be redeveloped for the benefit of the city, and more importantly, in which there wasn't a well-organized community that could challenge this. So these are some of the less salutary ways the city redevelops itself in the 1950s and 1960s. There actually are some positive things the city does, or I should say less questionably positive, as there will be, you could make an argument that the redevelopment of these areas actually benefited the city in the long run. One is the railroad beds that divided the South End from the Back Bay. Remember, these railroad lines had been built into Boston in the 1830s, 40s. By the turn of the 20th century, this area was a very busy railroad depot with freight cars coming in. But of course, by the 1950s, the railroads are pretty much obsolete. So Boston has at its urban center acres of railroad tracks, unused railroad tracks. Mayor Hynes sees here an opportunity to attract a major American corporation to build its headquarters on these railroad beds. And the company that does so is the Prudential, a life insurance company, building the tallest building in Boston on what were at this time unused railroad beds, beginning the redevelopment of this area between the Back Bay and the South End. Of course, the first new John Hancock building had been built in the 1940s, and it's a great testament that these two companies, John Hancock and the Prudential, are going to invest in building corporate headquarters and large office buildings in the center of Boston. At this time, in the years after the Second World War, companies are actually moving out of cities and building their corporate headquarters in places like Warwick, Rhode Island, or the immediate suburbs of New York. They're not investing and building in cities. So it's a major achievement of the Hynes administration to have the Prudential and John Hancock build their headquarters in Boston. So you have here arguments about the best way to redesign Boston. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the city government was very much in a league with the business leaders in thinking about the best ways of attracting new business to Boston. And the idea of the new Boston was one in contrast to the old Boston of James Michael Curley. And Curley had been about the people in the neighborhoods, working with the neighborhoods, as opposed to the business interests. In the 1950s and 60s, there's a shift away from the neighborhoods and toward revitalizing the downtown of Boston. And it's a balance that cities need to strike.